Hello. I know, this costume's a little bit janky, a little bit crooked. She's over a decade old. Cut her some slack. We're bringing this one out of the closet for me to talk about how I made my Padme Amidala costume when I was 14. And this girl has seen a lot of action because she has been worn by my mom almost every single May 4th since I've made the costume in October of 2013. And yes, Sable was my little Annie. And our mom made his costume as well. Okie pokey weirdos, I'm Rev, and welcome to my world of cosplay shenaniganery. Firstly, and it's not even how the sleeves would actually be. I'd be playing with them all day. Firstly, I will explain to you how I made this specific costume that I'm wearing right now when I was 14. Then, I will explain how I would make this costume now if I were to update it. While I'm not planning on updating this costume anytime soon, and I'm not even sure if I ever will because there's a lot that goes into it and I have so many other characters that I'd like to cosplay instead of continuously updating ones that I already have done. I did feel it would be helpful to those who are trying to make their own Padme costumes if I went over how I would make the costume now as compared to how I made this one. So let's go from head to toe and talk about how I made this Padme Amidala costume. And because I was 14, I did have a little bit of help from my mom because I was very early in my costume journey. You could easily say this was my first cosplay. And I didn't know how to do everything. I didn't know what would work best, so I did check in with her whenever I would get stuck. First up, the headpiece. The base for the headpiece is half of the wire structure for a Christmas wreath. I started out by covering that wreath in newspaper and polyfill, wrapping masking tape around it until I had this thick, chunky structure. And I don't know if the camera can pick it up. I might have to record it later, but let's see if you can hear the crunching. Or I really should have just used polyfill. But I wanted something a little sturdier than polyfill to help hold the structure outward. Then I thrifted brown fuzzy jogger sweatpants, made a sleeve out of one of the pant legs, and then pulled that kind of sock-like structure over the wreath shape. And all the hair wrapped around this is from Dollar Tree. I bought a whole bunch of those little headbands for kids that have the hair with streamers. I pulled out all of the glittery streamers and ripped the weft of hair off of the headbands and then wrapped that hair around the newspaper jogger pant leg covered wreath shape. And then the edges for these were hot glued down. I was not using a sewing machine by this point, so a lot of this project is hot glued or hand sewn. For what I call the earmuffs, these little circular shapes here, I got a 2-pack of those foam circles that you're supposed to stab fake flowers into to help the fake flowers stand up. And then I cut about 1/4 of those circles off so I'd have a flat edge to glue these down and have closer to the proper shape. And these little earmuffs are wrapped in fabric, which were a gold shirt that I thrifted for about $4, I believe. And I still have scraps of this shirt. I didn't quite use the whole shirt, so I have like the whole back of the shirt still left, and I use little scraps of it here and there for other projects. For the pieces that I call my blinders, they drive me bananas. My peripheral is really cut off. It's about there. Do the little fursuit check peripheral game. I have better peripheral vision in most of my fursuits. The blinders are made out of cardboard. I traced a kind of blade-esque shape onto a piece of paper, then traced it out onto cardboard and cut out 2 pieces of cardboard that are the blade-like shapes. For the fabric that the shapes are wrapped in, I got red t-shirt material, thrifted red t-shirt, and hand-sewed the red down, you can actually see the raw edges on this thing, because I should have pillowcased it and had the raw edges on the inside, but I was 14 and did not think about that at the time. And I used more of that gold fabric along the sides, as well as I put a light spread of gold glitter glue along the red to get that shimmer. And if you look at the back, to cover up the back of my head, I used red minky left over from me attempting to make a Luffy shirt. That project was never finished, and I reused the scraps to cover the back of my head and still match the costume, so that I wouldn't have to do all of the hair braiding and details that are in the back of her actual costume. Moving down, we now have the neck piece. This piece is actually made out of a pair of sweatpants that I thrifted. You can see the waistband for the sweatpants, and these are the hips of the sweatpants. And this length is one of the pant legs. So I cut off the legs of the sweatpants, tightened up the waistband until it was just small enough that I could still get it over my head, and hand sewed up the crotch seam, then hot glued one half of one of the pant legs to the underside of the pant hips. For the fuzzy brown borders, I continued to use the same fuzzy brown joggers that I used for the headpiece and made the furry brown borders, hot gluing all of those down. Some of them are hand stitched, but I eventually started running low on time and got to hot gluing everything. And all of the little detailing on these is gold glitter glue. I piped them on myself, and I actually had a little bit of an accident while doing this. I forgot this piece was laying in the floor drying, and when I went running through the house to go grab something, I stepped on it. And I actually took a picture of this, because when I very carefully and gently pulled my heel away from the project, realizing that I just stepped on wet paint, I was going, oh God, oh no, please don't be ruined. I was careful enough, gentle enough, and the glitter glue was just dry enough and only ever so slightly tacky that it left an imprint of one of the swirls on my heel. And if I can find that picture, I will put it up here, because I thought that was hilarious. Even the back flaps on these for the brown pieces are not fully glued down. I only did the edges so that I could get this thing done. It's all loose and floppy. For the big piece of the costume, we have what is essentially a snuggie. I wanted something really big and comfortable, and when I went to the thrift store, I was originally looking for a robe that I could work with, but the snuggie actually turned out perfect, because I had this big rectangle of fabric that already had sleeves on it, and I didn't have to do a whole lot for this thing. This snuggie originally had a blue line across the chest, so to cover up that design, the red sweatpant material that was mostly the neck piece, I hot glued down over any part that would be showing around the neck piece. Otherwise, I didn't have to cover it a whole lot. Most of it's covered up by the neck piece. The brown joggers came in handy again for these sleeves, hot gluing and hand stitching down these cuffs, as well as the little flaps to give more of a bell sleeve effect. For the orange bulbs down at the bottom of her dress, I took thrifted orange t-shirt material, cut out half circles, covered the bottom in black felt, and hot glued down around the edges until I had just a little hole left open, and I filled those with polyfill, then hot glued down that last little slit I'd left open, and I had puffy little bulbs. The brown border was more of that jogger material, and for my shoes, my mom and I both choose to simply wear black comfy shoes, because the shoes aren't really seen a whole lot since this snuggie is so large and so long. So that is how I made my Padme Amidala costume with my mom's help when I was 14. Almost completely out of thrifted or recycled materials. Now we get to how I would make this costume these days if I ever did do an updated version. Again, I am unlikely to do that anytime soon. If it becomes a large demand on all the social medias and people really want to see how I would do it, I might. But this video will need to get some serious traction for me to be willing to make this costume over again, and with so much more detail. So let's go from head to toe and see how I would make this now. For the headpiece, I would make a big EVA foam helmet. Everything that you see in the pictures that is gold, I would make as the helmet, and then the brown hair piece would be a cylindrical EVA foam piece I would attach later. The helmet I would probably sculpt out of paper and tinfoil until I got the shape I want, make a tape pattern, then cut it out of EVA foam, glue it together, use that same pattern to cut out the gold fabric to cover it in. The little bulbs on the top of her helmet I likely would make out of a really lightweight clay and then glue it on real quick. And when I was making this costume the first time, I didn't realize that there are multiple shades of gold, so I'd have to go through and find what sections are the lighter gold and the darker gold. I would sew all of the red and gold fabric together and then put it over the helmet like a pillowcase, hot gluing down the edges as I went. For the brown cylindrical piece, I would make that out of EVA foam as well, then still use the method of making a brown fabric sleeve to cover it in, as well as buy a whole bunch of wigs, cut the wefts apart, and wrap it in hair, more properly gluing down the hair, unlike this one, so that the hair is cemented in place. I might even make a tulle tube to cover the hair to protect it and keep it where it is. And then of course she has all of those braids, different loops of hair hanging down past her shoulders and to about mid-back. So I would use extensions and wefts from wigs to create that effect. Finally, once the gold helmet is completed and once the brown cylindrical sausage has been covered in hair, I would glue the two pieces together and then I'd be able to take the helmet on and off, up and down, instead of having to wedge my head backwards inside this thing, because that is really annoying. I get so worried about my makeup. As well as my wig cap, because my wig cap is lost inside this thing now. It is popped off. It is not on my head anymore. Or maybe slightly. And I might still even use gold glitter glue for the red sections because there's that gold shimmer to the fabric and I feel like it likely has golden threads woven throughout it. But that fabric's a little more expensive and harder to find. So the glitter glue would be enough of an illusion to that for me. For shoulders section 1, this very top layer, because this I made all one piece, technically it's two pieces. You have the very top layer, which is this bright red, very textured fabric. It would be fun to have to research and look for this really bubbly, lumpy, textured looking fabric. If I couldn't find something like that, I would likely do a quilting situation with a whole bunch of lumps and curves and bubbles to get that effect. And the very top shoulder piece holds out really far, so I'd be looking at putting in a lot of stiffener, interfacing, or even having an interior layer of really stiff canvas to help hold those shoulders out and hold the structure in the shape that I want. Then I would buy actual brown faux fur that has some color variation to it that is actually like fluffy to make the brown borders and sew them on instead of hot gluing them. A little embroidered flap that's attached to the first shoulder piece would be made out of the base structure fabric of the dress. Of course, I would get the brown faux fur border around it. And because I don't have an embroidery machine, what I would likely do is draw the shape out with puffy paint and then use gold embroidery thread, hand sewing looping around that puffy paint. Or else it might actually be worth it for me to pay somebody to make appliques for me, because that is very time consuming. Shoulder section part 2. It's another flap where I need it to have really strong structure, especially since the very top one will be weighing it down. So this is another one that would likely get an interlining of canvas or very stiff interfacing. And this piece would be made with the fabric that is the base structure of the dress. It is a gorgeous textured, silky kind of fabric. I have gotten this kind of fabric for a different project, and I use that fabric for a backdrop a lot because I love the blood red color that I got. So I would likely go get this fabric in bright red to make Padme. So the very high quality looking, sleek, beautiful fabric would be much better quality than snuggly sweatpants and snuggy fabric. And the faux fur border on this one may get wired too. For both shoulder pieces, I would likely pattern them out of paper real quick and make sure that I can get the shape and size that I want. With that paper pattern, I would add the long length that has most of the embroidery on it. Again, the embroidery would be either puffy paint and embroidery thread, or I would be ordering appliques from somebody. On this second shoulder piece, she also has a length in the back that reaches, I believe, just past her lower back. So I would have to add that piece to the pattern as well. And don't forget those brown fuzzy borders. Now I'm going to separate between the sleeves and the dress because the sleeves are a completely different monster from the dress. While I like making my own patterns, I would suggest some sort of massive bell sleeve pattern for these sleeves. I see a lot of them on Etsy, so anything absolutely huge and flowing will be perfect. And then it's going to need some alterations because the sleeves and the dress both have all of this paneling, so the pattern will have to be sliced up based upon the number of panels. So what you would have to do is count up the number of panels you want, divide that by the width of the sleeve, and then cut the pattern into those panels. Then add about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, if not more. I'd probably go 1 inch seam allowance to get the borders for the panels in. Because with each panel, you have this really thick line in between. And the way I would make that happen is when you fold over the fabric to hide the raw edge on the inside of the costume, I would use a fold from each panel and have them lock into each other, sew that down, and then top stitch it so that that thickness is visible to the outside, and then you'll have those thick little lines in between each panel. Piping the border with fur, and there's also the little interior sleeve inside the really big sleeves, which is telling me that she's wearing another layer under this, but I would not want another layer. So I would make fake little cuffs to go inside the sleeve, making a tight to the wrist red cuff, and then sewing that to a brown fur cuff, and the brown fur cuff would get sewn to the inside of the sleeve where the fur of the largest sleeve is folded down inside. And it would be kind of like a stitch in the ditch to keep those two furs together. And then you can't actually see down inside the larger sleeve because then the smaller brown cuff cuts off the visual for anybody looking at the costume just down inside the larger cuff. And for the fingers, her thumbnails are painted white and it looks like the rest of her nails are a clear coat. Mine today are leftover from Valentine's Day because I'm filming this immediately after Valentine's Day. So enjoy the pink and red. Finally, we are to how I would make the dress if I made it these days. For most people, I would suggest one of the generic medieval dress patterns and then slightly alter it. Again, I like to make my own patterns. So the way I would do it is there is a straight tube of fabric until you hit about Natalie's lower hips. So I would measure the widest part on my upper body, which is my bust, then divide that by the number of panels and make the panels the same way I would make the sleeves, then cutting up that width into the panels and adding about an inch worth of seam allowance to each panel so that again the folded over edges can be locked into each other and top stitched on either side of the fold. I would measure out the circumference of my hips and do the same paneling method, finding a more gradual slope between my bust measurement and my hips. Finally, ending all of these measurements with how wide of a circumference I want for the bottom of the dress, adding a gradual slope between the hips and to the widest part of the dress as well, leaving me with a pattern that would likely look something like this. Very similar to a pattern for bell bottoms, I suppose, but much larger. I'd be wearing one giant bell bottom leg. And for the bottom faux fur border, I would make a big tube of faux fur that I would loop turn, and with it being a tube, then I can slide a structure on the inside of it and keep that big hoop open. I'd make it something like a hoop skirt, but I was thinking more like putting bamboo reeds in it, because I was considering how Adam Savage made his Totoro costume, and Totoro is still very flexible and bouncy and has some give. And I would love for the shape at the bottom of the skirt to have that same kind of flexibility. So I would use bamboo or some sort of artificial material that's very similar to leave me a nice big hoop at the bottom of my skirt. And for the length of the dress, I would make sure that it just doesn't touch the ground, because I would hate to have this thing dragging while I'm walking around at something like a convention or for photo shoots. I would want to make sure that even if it gets a little dirty because it's so close to the ground, it's not actually touching the ground. For those bright orange orbs at the bottom of her dress, I would want to put LEDs in them. So we're looking at making those oval shapes out of plastizote or light diffusing EVA foam, and then covering that bottom half in some sort of black fabric, then weaving LED lights throughout the bottom of the dress. And for LEDs like this, I'd send you over to Katie Simrail's video on how they made their centaur costume, because that would be pretty much the same method I would use to make the orbs glow, and I would want them to look like fiery and flashy. Very similar concept, but a much smaller build for LEDs only at the bottom of my dress. With having all of those LEDs on the inside, I would want to make something like a pocket for them to sit in that I can also remove so that I can throw the costume in the washer and it'll be perfectly fine. So I'm thinking make a fabric piece that covers that whole ring where the LEDs will be, and make it a piece that is removable with Velcro so that the lights can be attached and removed, and the only thing that won't be washed is that little piece of fabric that's a ring around the inside of the skirt. And then there would be holes at the bottom of the dress where the lights can come through to the inside of the plastizote pieces. Me wanting to be able to stick the dress in the washer would also mean that the plastizote pieces need to be removable, and I believe I'd do Velcro or snaps with those as well. For the shoes, I feel like I'd still go with really comfy shoes, because if I'm making this thing just barely not touch the ground, nobody's really going to be seeing my shoes. I'm going to go with something black and comfortable so that they hide and I can still easily walk around a convention and hang out, because the big headpiece is going to be enough to overstimulate me anyway, as well as having so many people around. I don't need to be wearing heels, okay? And that is how I made my Padme Amidala costume when I was 14, and how I would make a Padme Amidala costume now if I updated it. If I get enough requests too, I might go ahead and update this costume sooner rather than later. And you can follow me along on Ko-fi and Patreon if you want to see anything that I'm currently working on at the moment. I love all of my amazing weirdos, and I would greatly appreciate it if you do all the YouTuber-y things, because it lets YouTube know that you want me to stick around, and it also lets me know that I should keep coming back. So get those subs, comms, thumbs, and a ding. Share this video with any Star Wars fans who want to make costumes too, and welcome to the madness. Blech. There's still hair. Oh my god. I'm gonna be so happy when I can take this off, because the hair makes it really itchy. That is something else I'd want to fix. I'd make sure that the helmet completely covers my face from the hair touching me, and that's why I would want the tulle tube over the hair, because this is so freaking itchy. For the big piece of the costume is these sleeves. I don't know if I look crazy now. I always look crazy. What am I talking about? It's still freaking stabbing me in the eye. Stop it! Yeah. Of course, it would get the brown faux fur. For those gold. They're not gold. What the heck? This is really annoying. Are you done? I can see you, little hair.